All right, council members, Councilmember, you've been joined by Councilmember Brooke Pinto. We're now live on YouTube, and you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Councilmember Pinto. And good afternoon, all. I'm Robert White, Councilmember at Large and Chair of the Committee on Government Operations and Facilities. Today is Thursday, October 6th, 2022. The time is 12:02 p.m. and we are meeting remotely via the Zoom teleconferencing platform. I'm calling to order this public hearing of the Committee on Government Operations and Facilities on Bill B-24-785, the Greener Government Buildings Amendment Act of 2022. Human-driven climate change has already changed the face of the earth in deep ways that will reverberate for millions of years to come. Species are going extinct at rates previously only associated with tectonic events and ice ages. In addition to being a great tragedy in its own right, the destabilization of biospheres threatens the world's food supply and contributes to accelerating erosion of habitats for humans and the broader environment. Meanwhile, deadly droughts and heat waves are increasing in frequency and intensity. Sea level rise makes coastal communities more vulnerable to flooding. Just this past weekend, the remnants of Hurricane Ian drifted over DC. The storm caused historic damage in South Florida due in part to warmer ocean temperatures. And with all these catastrophes, the poorest communities will generally be worse positioned to stand resilient against all these challenges. As both a coastal city and a world capital, the District of Columbia should be doing everything we can to mitigate these human-driven harms and help prepare future generations of DC for the new realities of life on this planet. By some estimates, 18% of all energy use in the district is attributable to government facilities. Of course, many of those are federal facilities, but our local contribution is significant as well. As of this March, the Department of General Services, or DGS, reported to this committee that they were responsible for managing over 35 million square feet of building space. And a lot of that building stock consists of aging properties, like historic school buildings that were not built with energy efficiency in mind. In 2019, the council passed and the mayor signed a law called the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act. This important bill expanded on the district's pre-existing climate-related initiatives, Sustainable DC and Clean Energy DC. It created some specific mandates with the overall aim of cutting our greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2032. One notable provision calls for DGS to develop and release a plan to perform energy retrofits, which means working on existing buildings to reduce their energy needs with things like modern insulated windows and smart systems to avoid wasteful usage of lights and air conditioning. Among other things, DGS's plan was supposed to detail how much we would need to spend and where to retrofit 9% of our building stock and achieve a 30% reduction in energy and emissions by the end of 2024. The plan was initially due in January 2020, before the onset of the COVID pandemic. It was ultimately delivered 29 months late, and in the meantime, the district's deployment of retrofits has been inadequate. Looking at the report, it is still difficult to tell exactly how much money DGS is saying we need to invest in the next 2 years to meet the reduction goals we set for ourselves more than 3 years ago. I'm very concerned about our ability as a council to fully evaluate DGS's next budget proposal without this full analysis. We need to take more aggressive action. Last year, after talking with local advocates, including the Sierra Club, the Washington Interfaith Network, and Interfaith Power and Light, I was persuaded that the district government might take on more of a leading role in demonstrating net zero readiness as soon as we can get a bill passed and funded, which at this point means October 2023 at the earliest. So on April 22nd of this year, I introduced the Greener Government Buildings Amendment Act, along with council members Brianna Doe, Charles Allen, Brooke Pinto, and Janice Lewis-George. The bill before us today would amend an existing green building law to require that when the district government builds or substantially improves a building over 10,000 square feet, the building must meet net zero energy standards. Net zero energy readiness, or NZE, refers to a collection of practices that result in a building using less electricity than it produces, either in the form of on-site solar, geothermal, or other renewable energy generation, or through the funding of additional or off-site renewable energy production. Measuring consumption and generation of each building helps us adhere to our all-important energy reduction and renewable energy production goals at every step. The bill would also prohibit installation of new fossil fuel systems to avoid locking ourselves into pollutive technologies for decades or having to pay extra to replace them while they're still fully functional. Before I discuss the bill's other features, it's important to note that a few months after I introduced this bill, we unanimously passed and the mayor signed into law a separate piece of legislation called the Clean Energy DC Building Code Amendment Act. Among other effects, that new law will update the building code to require all new and substantially improved buildings in DC, both government and commercial, to meet NZE standards beginning in 2027. That's a very important step, and I'm proud to have voted in favor of it. The key difference in this bill is that it would position government buildings at the forefront of NZE implementation. As written, this mandate for government buildings will go into effect as soon as it's fully funded, which could conceivably happen as early as next fall if the mayor and the council work together to find the funding. Yet another recent bill, the Climate Commitment Act of 2022, bans installation of new fossil fuel equipment in government buildings, except where that's, quote, technically infeasible, end quote. I did not include a technical feasibility provision in my bill, and I want to hear more from DGS and our public witnesses about our ability to phase out fossil fuels across the board. In addition to accelerating the NZE and fossil fuel-free mandates for government buildings, the bill before us would create a new series of trainings every 2 years regarding important construction and building maintenance techniques. DGS would be required to offer these trainings not only to government employees, but also to outside interested parties such as small and local businesses. This is very important because local businesses that employ local workers currently play a huge role in building and maintaining our government facilities. If we're complacent and don't affirmatively work to help these businesses and workers stay up to speed, they will run the risk of getting left out of the green building future. I'm eager to hear from the experts at DGS as to how my bill would alter their current trajectory. I understand that Matt Flocka, the Associate Director for Sustainability and Energy Management at DGS, will present testimony on behalf of the Mayor's administration, and that Tiffany Moore, the Deputy Director for Capital Construction, will also be with us to help answer questions. I appreciate these professionals' hard work, and I hope that we can work together to drive more rapid energy and innovation in the district. Let me now turn to my colleague, Brooke Pinto, if you have an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Chairman White. And thank you for introducing this important bill and holding this hearing today. I was proud to be a co-introducer on this and think it's a really important step in the right direction. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time, not the most pressing issue of our time. And it is imperative that we address the issue for current generations and for generations to come, ensuring that we all have the opportunity to live on a healthy and sustainable planet. We can tackle this issue in a myriad of ways, including education, infrastructure planning, and increased use of renewable energy, and in small ways in how we all live our everyday lives, like unplugging appliances not in use, using hybrid or electric cars or other modes of transportation and public transit. But we know that emissions from our buildings make up over 70% of our emissions in our city. I'm going to say that again, emissions from our buildings make up over 70% of emissions in our city. And so everything else we do is really chipping around the edges. But if we get our emissions of our buildings down, we can make a huge impact here. And government buildings are a major player in that effort and cannot and should not be exempt from what we're continuing to ask the private sector to do in their building emissions. As we hear scientists link climate change to increases in extreme weather events, like last week's devastating hurricane, we understand even more the urgency of this issue. And it's critical that the district continues its commitment to the environment in word and action. And this bill is a stepping stone toward a healthier planet and reducing the impacts of climate change here at home. So I look forward to hearing testimony on this topic and this important bill as we continue our commitment to protecting the environment and battling climate change. So thank you very much again to you, Chairman White, for your leadership in this space and to all the work of your team on this critical issue.
Thanks so much, Councilmember Pinto. Everyone should have received a copy of the witness list yesterday. I'm going to call witnesses in the order that they appear on the list. When I call you, staff will promote you so that you can testify. When you are promoted, you'll drop out of the hearing momentarily and come back in as a panelist, at which time you'll be able to unmute yourself. Public witnesses will have 4 minutes to testify, and advisory neighborhood commissioners will have 5 minutes to testify. We will do 2 panels of 5 witnesses, starting with Mark Rodifer with Beyond Gas DC and co-chair of the Sierra Club, Cliff Madrasik, senior advisor at the Institute for Market Transformation, Madison Mayhew, congressional organizer with the Interfaith Power and Light, Edward Yim with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and Jean Stewart, who is a public witness. I don't know of an affiliation. Mark Rodifer, welcome, and you can begin your testimony when you're ready.
All right, excuse me. Thank you, Councilmember White, and thanks for holding this hearing, and thanks for introducing the Greener Government Buildings Act, which, as you mentioned, the Sierra Club, Washington Interfaith Network, and Interfaith Power and Light asked you to do. We completely agree with you that DC government buildings need to transition off of dirty energy and onto electricity from renewable buildings. And we need to do that through net zero buildings. They generate energy on site over the course of a year equal to the amount of energy that the building consumes over the course of a year. So this requires that they maximize their energy consumption through energy efficiency measures while minimize their energy consumption through energy efficiency while maximizing generation from renewable energy. If any additional energy is needed for the building, it must be provided by renewable energy from electricity that directly serves the buildings. Net zero buildings have lower operational costs because they use so little energy. They don't combust fossil fuels, which improves indoor air quality and avoids health threats from things like asthma and respiratory ailments that are associated with fossil fuel combustion. The definition of net zero buildings from the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act, which, as you mentioned, was passed unanimously and signed over the summer, that definition requires that starting in 2026, all new buildings, whether they're privately or publicly owned, be net zero. The DC Building Code Act defines net zero with a clean energy hierarchy, prioritizing energy efficiency, maximizing on-site renewable generation, and only then allowing for limited procurement of energy that directly serves the building in the form of long-term contracts called power purchase agreements. And we think that the DC government absolutely should lead by example here, and we think that is the intent of this bill. But we think that as written, there is a very problematic loophole in this bill. The definition of net zero says Appendix Z, or other standards that the mayor sets that ensure each building is energy efficient and procures renewable energy generation. Under this other standard set by the mayor, anything could be defined as energy efficient, and the DC government could buy renewable energy credits for offsite energy that does not serve the building, and the building could be considered net zero. So this would actually allow the government to bypass the energy efficiency and renewable energy requirements of private buildings. So as I said, it acts as a loophole, and we think that absolutely the definition of net zero in this bill needs to change. And it should change to be the same definition as the DC Building Code Act, which in section 2A3 says that to be net zero, renewable energy has to be generated at the building wherever feasible. To the extent that a building procures electricity from off-site sources, the building may not use renewable energy credits for electricity that does not directly serve the building. So that's getting at what we see as the problem of net zero in this bill. And if this definition is adopted, rather than the other code set by the mayor, this problem will be solved. And lastly, from the DC Clean Energy, from the DC Building Code Act, it states that on-site fuel combustion shall not be permitted for the provision of thermal energy to the building. So we think that this legislation needs to have the same definition. And if it contains the definition now, allowing the mayor to set other standards, we would oppose passage of this bill, which we don't want to do because we absolutely think the DC government should be doing this before private building owners. And we think that the way to do this is to adopt the definition of net zero from the DC Building Code Act. I won't get into it here, but in my written testimony, I addressed some of the concerns from DGS about the bill. We think most of their concerns are not founded, but we applaud DGS for building 2 net zero schools and planning more. And we're confident that DGS can ensure that all DC government buildings are net zero, saving taxpayers money, reducing indoor air pollution, and emitting zero climate pollution. So thank you again, Councilmember White, for the opportunity to testify today. We really appreciate you introducing this legislation. We 100% agree with the goal of this legislation. We want to work with you to make sure that the Greener Government Building Acts make sure that DC government buildings, new and substantially renovated DC government buildings, are in fact net zero. So thank you very much for allowing me to testify today.
Thank you so much. Let me take this opportunity to say I agree with you, Mark Rada, for the definition in the DC Building Codes bill came into existence after we wrote this bill. So we reference what existed before. We are not going to create any loophole. I agree that we should make our definition in line with that one. So I just want to clarify that point. I know there's a bit of concern. I share that concern too, but we actually already have drafted a committee print that makes that change. Let me move to Cliff Madrasic, and if I mispronounce your last name, let me apologize and ask for a correction.
Thank you very much, Chairman White. Thank you, Councilmember Pinto, for the opportunity to testify. My name is Cliff Majerzik, so you're very close. I am Senior Advisor with the Institute for Market Transformation, and we are a group that works with more than 100 jurisdictions around the country, including Washington, D.C., to help put in place programs and policies to drive decarbonization of buildings. And we work on building codes. I helped write the Clean Energy DC plan, working under subcontract to the district. I worked with Councilmember Che to help write the Clean Energy DC Act and the Clean Energy DC Buildings Code Amendment Act. And I'm thrilled to hear that you're planning to align this with the Building Codes Act definition of net zero, because as Mark said, the current language would allow for, would have out of alignment, and you would potentially have a risk that DGS would be held to a lower standard than all other buildings in this district. And I don't think that's what you intend or what anyone wants. You know, one way to accomplish the alignment would just be to strike lines 50 through 56 of your bill and to replace it with net zero energy compliance means compliance with Appendix Z. As you defined Appendix Z in the bill, all buildings will be required to follow Appendix C once the building code is updated as per the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act. And so that just makes sure that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, that we're not holding DGS buildings to a lower standard. Now, I salute the fact that you want this to go into effect earlier for DGS buildings than for other buildings, and I absolutely approve of that. I think that should be done with respect to all new construction. There could be some flexibility which could be provided, I think, for major renovations where there could be challenges. But absolutely for all new construction, they shouldn't have any gas equipment in them, and they should be built to Appendix C standards or better. There's going to be a great return on investment from that, from building our buildings better in the first place and renovating our buildings. And I like the DGS energy management plan, which they published. I wish, as you have said, that they would have published it earlier, but I think they've done a good job. And I agree with you that it's unfortunate that the plan doesn't lay out exactly how much money is going to be needed. We are going to need to make billions of dollars of investment in our buildings. And we need for DGS to provide those figures quickly and for the council to fully fund that so that we can really lead by example, so that we can walk the walk. I do think that DGS has put together a good team that's working on this, and I'm eager to hear their testimony on the bill. We're happy to work with, we are working with DGS and with Department of Energy and the Environment and others to make sure that the district is an example for the country, as we've been so many times in the past. The Clean Energy DC Act created building energy performance standards, and there are now 9 other jurisdictions around the country, including 3 states, including Maryland, as well as New York City and other cities that have followed DC's lead in adopting that law and adopting building performance standards. And there are now 37 jurisdictions that are part of President Biden's Building Performance Standard Coalition that are all committed to adopting their own building performance standards by Earth Day of 2024. So there's a real opportunity for the district with this legislation to lead again, and we are eager to work with you and with the agencies to help make that happen. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Next, Madison Mayhew, very good to see you.
Likewise, good afternoon. My name is Madison Mayhew. I use she, her pronouns. I live on Capitol Hill. I'm a member of Calvary Baptist Church, and I work to help DC congregations of all faiths take action on climate change through interfaith power and light. Thank you so much for holding this hearing, and thank you for your leadership on addressing climate change in DC. I share some of the same concerns that have been shared already, so bear with me through this testimony. I'm speaking in support of the Greener Government Buildings Act this afternoon, but only after this bill adopts the same definition of net zero energy as in the recently passed Clean Energy DC Building Code Act. As currently written, this bill before us contains a loophole that would allow government buildings to be much less green than the current law now requires of new private sector buildings. Our faith communities lead by example and understand their call to moral leadership. For years, congregations across the district have been determined to lead the way in greening their buildings, from going solar to electrifying to greening their grounds, and some even keep bees. Our congregations aren't encouraging or requiring their members to do one thing and then hold themselves to a lower standard. Rather, our congregations have long been beacons in our communities, choosing to lead the way on green practices with the hope that others would follow in our wake. In fact, when St. Albans Parish in Cathedral Heights became the first congregation in the district to go solar 13 years ago this fall, the rector described the solar panels on the roof as their newest stained glass windows, proclaiming their values to the world, giving testimony to all who see them about the promise of a clean energy future. To set a standard for government buildings that is weaker than defined by the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act, Council would be sending a message, but it would not be one of moral leadership. DC government buildings should join faith communities in leading the way and meet the same standards required by new private buildings. We want this bill to live up to its name, and right now, as written, it would be more accurate to call this legislation the less green government buildings, since it would require new government buildings to be less green than those in the private sector are now required to be. The Greener Government Buildings Act should define the net zero the same way as it is defined in Section 2 of the DC Building Code Act and fully commit to net zero energy. I urge every member of the council to think about what environmental leadership means to you. Surely it means that the bill's requirements for the government's own buildings must be at least as strong, if not stronger, than the existing requirements that have been set for every other new building. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I want to welcome Edward Yim. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman White and Councilmember Pinto. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments on this bill. As the other speakers have already mentioned, I was furiously revising my testimony in light of what the chairman has mentioned. So I'll try to truncate my comments significantly. So my name is Edward Yin, and I lead Attributable State and Utility Policy Team. I'm a former staff at DOE, and during my tenure, I led the development of the Clean Energy DC plan that included building energy performance standards and net zero code to fight climate change, which was one of a few in the nation at the time. And I authored the Solar for All implementation plan and the feasibility study of renewable power purchase contracts for DC residents. Attributable is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing energy efficiency through research, education, and conferences. So again, my testimony is really just limited to the definition of net zero energy compliance as proposed in the bill. So district has already established the definition of net zero energy for new buildings in the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act. However, this bill currently, as drafted, creates a new definition for net zero energy compliance, namely, which says that compliance with the net zero energy standard provided in such other standards as the mayor may adopt by rule. We respectfully oppose the creation of this alternative compliance pathway, and this alternative pathway would result in new district-owned buildings that are significantly less efficient and climate harming than other net zero energy buildings in the District of Columbia. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports regularly emphasize the essential role of efficiency and demand reduction as the cornerstone of greenhouse gas mitigation. And IPCC's 2018 special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees shows that a failure to maximize energy efficiency and demand reduction will greatly increase the risk of failure to keep the rise of global warming to 1.5 degrees. So greenwashing energy efficiency significantly undermines climate action. So constructing a net zero energy building may not be easy, but it is worth every effort for its long-term economic and health benefits. And it is worth the effort because it is essential to fighting climate change. And because departing from business as usual practices of constructing a new building is difficult, it requires a prudent legislative intervention such as the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act to compel such departure. This bill, the alternative compliance pathway, would allow district-owned buildings to revert to the business as usual, because it's really not innovative to simply require that new buildings take some efficiency measures and purchase renewable power. Given the market economics of efficiency and renewable power contracts, building owners already do that without any legislative intervention. So this is already the business as usual. So this alternative compliance pathway would allow new government buildings that are inefficient to qualify as net zero energy simply by making nominal efficiency investments and purchasing a lot of off-site green electricity. So that would be the greenwashing of the net zero energy code. The US Environmental Protection Agency recently strongly recommended against precisely this type of use of on-site power generation and off-site power purchases to bypass energy efficiency requirements in building standards. And we have seen these kinds of efforts in other proposed legislation. For DGS to lead by example, they must do more. At a minimum, they should be held to the same net zero energy standard that applies to non-district buildings. We understand that there may be budgetary constraints that could delay the timeline for district-owned buildings to comply with the net zero energy standard, and the council could consider timing remedies. However, we strongly urge not to weaken the definition of net zero energy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And finally, for this panel, Jean Stewart, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman White and Council Member Pinto and staff members. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. And while I have not been sitting here frantically crossing out things in my testimony, you know, the written part of my testimony addresses the same concerns as we've already heard. And when I was writing this, I realized, you know, I looked at the dates of submission and I thought, well, yeah, this draft bill was submitted before the July Act setting, you know, strong net zero criteria. And I won't go through, you know, the arguments that you've already heard, but now that I know that this section, specifically lines 50 through 56 in the draft legislation, are going to be replaced with language that would conform with the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act, which are very strong language, which is very strong language. And that makes me very happy. That change would make the Greener Government Buildings Act an excellent complement to the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act, and would definitely strengthen DC's overall leadership in reducing carbon emissions. This bill would then be, with these changes, would be fully aligned with the current law and would strengthen DC's overall commitments to reduce greenhouse gases, increase building efficiency, improve indoor air quality, and reduce utility costs for taxpayers. So I'm very encouraged that the bill will be so amended, and it will make it a very strong bill and very complementary to the current law. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this panel. The Less Green Government Buildings Act, Madison Mayhew coming in hot. I appreciate the advocacy. I recognize the concern. And do want to thank so many folks for working with us on this bill, and also as we have started to redraft a committee print. The concern obviously makes sense, and it's something that should be pointed out at a hearing. The point of these is to make bills stronger. Since we're on agreement on the main issue that was of concern, let me just touch on one other thing that I would love to get some thoughts on. Cliff, hold on.
Majurzik.
Majurzik.
I know it's tough.
Sorry. Cliff Majurzik, what challenges do you see for major renovations in the short term? So, not new construction, obviously we have more flexibility, but major renovations, what challenges do you see there in the short term?
Well, there can be a variety of challenges, and I think the DGS testimony did highlight some of those, where you have limited space in the equipment room for adding in a heat pump, say, where that room may be far from outdoor air, which a heat pump needs to exchange heat with outdoor air. If it's an air source heat pump, and where there is no access for ground source heat pump, where you need to drill into the ground to take advantage of the ground heat. Now, it's important to note that you don't need to have a ground source heat pump to be a net zero building. It's a helpful technology, but it's not a necessary technology. Where you don't have existing, you have a radiator system. Heat pumps typically rely on ductwork to circulate air as the way of heating or cooling the building. And if a building is currently heated with radiators, that can make it much more difficult to rely on heat pumps, because heat pumps can't cost effectively bring water to the same temperature as a boiler. So there can be challenges. They're overcomable, but I think you do need to provide some flexibility for DGS in the short term, rather than requiring DGS to necessarily comply with Appendix C in every case immediately. Under no circumstances, though, should DGS be held to a lower standard than the private sector. And the Appendix C will apply at some point to all buildings and to major renovations, as it should for DGS. I think whatever standard we apply to the private sector should be applied to DGS, and wherever possible, we should hold DGS to a higher standard, but under no circumstances should DGS be held to a lower standard.
Thank you for that. Edward Yim, do you have, based on the experience of the work you do now, or your work formerly at DOEE, do you have thoughts on what challenges will be likely to face with major rehabilitations of existing buildings?
Yeah, I think Cliff laid that out. I mean, DGS is likely to have a considerable number of buildings that are typically viewed as very challenging to do a major gut rehab or major retrofits for the reasons that Cliff mentioned. However, I do want to note that these problems are very well understood now, the nature of these problems, and there are technology solutions that are being developed by DOE and some of the national labs. And some of our European counterparts may have already found solutions to some of them, and it will be will be a matter of doing pilot projects of some of those new technologies that could provide air to water heating, for example, for some of those buildings. So that could help. From my time at DOE and my conversations at that time with some of my DGS colleagues was that one concern that they had really was the deferred maintenance that they already had on a lot of their buildings, and that they're feeling sort of saddled with dual obligations. And it is true that they have to, bring their buildings up to a certain level first in terms of essentially getting rid of the backlog, clearing the backlog of deferred maintenance on their buildings before they can do this first. So I think I understand that that's also a challenge and an issue as well. But mostly, I think there will be some heating technology challenges that we are considering, but I think there are solutions in the offing.
Mark Rutherford, do you have thoughts on this challenge? Is that the challenge of sort of limited flexibility for rehabilitation of existing buildings?
Well, I have two thoughts. The first one is, this is buildings that the definition of substantial renovation is buildings where the renovation is more than 50% of the cost of the building. So you're talking about huge renovations. You're not talking about something small. So these are already really big projects that you're spending a lot of money. You're really, revamping the building pretty substantially. So you can replace a lot of the systems that are in there because these aren't small projects. And the second one is with the clean energy hierarchy, as I called it from the DC Building Code Act. It says efficiency first, on-site renewable second. And then if you can't get where you need to go with that, you can have the power purchase agreements for electricity from renewable sources that directly serves the building, not a renewable energy credit, but electricity that goes into the grid for the purposes of serving the building. And so that can cover the things that we can't get through efficiency and that we can't get through on-site generation. So I think that the power purchase agreements can make up whatever it cannot be done in an existing building.
Okay, I appreciate that. And before I wrap up, yes, Cliff Majerzik.
Can I just add one thing? Yeah, one concern I do have, DGS, I believe, is looking at installing electric resistance boilers in some schools. And that heat pumps are the answer. We need for our buildings to be heated and cooled with heat pumps. Electric resistance, while it doesn't use gas, and that's a good thing, it is very inefficient. It will greatly increase the electric and utility costs for the district, and it's not a good climate solution. So I think it'd be very helpful for you and for the council to send a clear message to DGS. They need to focus on heat pumps and not use electric resistance boilers or other electric resistance solutions, except as a backup to the heat pump. They should not have any all electric resistance heat in our buildings.
I appreciate it. Let me turn to my colleague, Brooke Pinto.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I think that was a first for me, hearing all of our witnesses ask for a change and the chair saying, I completely agree, it's done. So I have no further questions for this panel, but thank you all for your clearly effective advocacy and work on this important bill. Thanks, Chairman.
Thanks so much. Well, let me thank you all again for being here with us today, but also your ongoing work and advocacy in this space. We look forward to working with you to try to pull this bill over the finish line. I will now turn to our second panel of public witnesses and want to welcome Patricia Briggs, a community member also with the Washington Interfaith Network, Shimani Overby, DC conservation advocate and with the Audubon Naturalist Society, Bill Mefford, executive director of the Festival Center, Chris Weiss, executive director of DC Environmental Network, and Barbara Briggs with Friends Meeting of Washington. And, Patricia Briggs, welcome. You can begin your testimony.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patricia Briggs. I am a volunteer leader with the Washington Interfaith Network. and a member of the St. Augustine Catholic Church. I applaud the effort in this bill to transition the district's government building off of gas, starting with new buildings. However, I have some concerns. As this bill is currently written, there are loopholes that potentially allow fossil fuel combustion in places where individuals work, live, and attend school. With wind, I spent the last year learning about methane gas and how the district's dependence on gas is harming our community's health and the climate. Together, a team of us learned that methane sold by Washington Gas accounts for 23% of the district's total greenhouse gases emissions. We learned that often in these buildings with gas appliances, the air that is breathed indoors is often more polluted than outdoor air. Our team knows that this continued reliance on methane gas poses a health risk and a climate risk. Some people can afford to switch out of furnaces of gas stoves, but what about those who can't afford it? I believe clean air is a human right. This means a public housing residents deserve healthy air in their homes. Children who attend schools deserve healthy air in their classrooms. Newly constructed and heavily redeveloped government buildings, which include public housing and schools, need to be net zero if the district is serious about meeting their climate commitments. Currently, the legislature allowed the mayor to set any definition for net zero, where appliances are not energy efficient and do not generate renewable energy on site, even if it has gas appliances. I would like for you to consider this. Prior to passing this bill, will you make sure that these loopholes are closed? Will you commit to moving the district closer to meeting the net zero gas of having a green economy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Briggs. Want to welcome our next public witness, Shimani Overby.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Shimani Overby, and I am the District of Columbia Conservation Advocate for the Audubon Naturalist Society. For 125 years, Audubon Naturalist Society has inspired people to enjoy, learn about, and protect nature. Our conservation priorities are human health and access to nature, biodiversity and habitat, fighting the climate crisis, and sustainable land use. The urgency of climate crisis is evident across our country today, and that urgency underscores the importance of being careful and intentional about bills like this one, including the Greener Government Buildings Act. As a lot of my colleagues have mentioned, I will be underscoring some of the same concerns, but please bear with me. Some problems with the Greener Government Buildings Act as currently written. It sets a lower bar for what qualifies as net zero energy building that was recently passed in the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act. This allows the DC government to avoid meeting the climate friendly requirements of the recently passed act. The Greener Government Buildings Act definition of net zero does not meet the definition of net zero used by architects, engineers, and building professionals. And unlike the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act, the Greener Government Buildings Act does not provide a hierarchy of implementation that prioritizes energy efficiency, maximizing on-site renewable generation, and only after those priorities are achieved, allowing for limited off-site energy procurement in the form of long-term contracts for electricity from renewable sources known as power purchase agreements. On behalf of ANS, I recommend that the Greener Government Buildings Act adopt the same definition of net zero energy as passed in the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act. If the Greener Government Buildings Act does not adopt the same definition of net zero energy, which it has, as the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act and the proposed legislation would increase greenhouse gas emissions, allowing for more indoor air pollution that harms human health and increase utility costs for taxpayers. ANS cannot fully support the passage of this act unless it is amended to require highly efficient government buildings that generate clean energy on site. As we develop and create climate legislation, it is imperative that all present and future policies reflect the bold commitments DC has already made to climate mitigation. DC's current and future commitments to climate mitigation and energy efficiency are a step towards a more equitable society. Thank you for your time and leadership on climate change in the district. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Bill Mefford, welcome. You're on mute, Bill.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Chairman White, so much. And thank you also to Councilmember Pinto for this opportunity to testify on this important issue. I'm Bill Mefford, Executive Director of the Festival Center, Community Center that provides affordable housing for nonprofit organizations, justice-seeking organizations, and non-brick and mortar faith communities in Washington, D.C. I'm testifying today in support of, no surprise, holding government buildings to the same high standard for net zero buildings set by the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act. I'm currently overseeing a massive renovation of our building in Adams Morgan on Columbia Road, so I can attest to the entirely reasonable request that all new buildings in the district be highly efficient and generate clean energy on site. We are doing this. I can say this because we at the Festival Center are doing it. Here's how. We're installing a brand new HVAC system, added insulation, LED lighting, and we will dramatically lower our energy usage and bring us greater efficiency. We will have a new state-of-the-art kitchen used by nonprofit organizations for culinary arts classes and food entrepreneurs, and the kitchen will be entirely electric. And finally, because we found out that buildings cause an alarming 75% of all carbon emissions in Washington, D.C., we have chosen to invest in solar panels, which will bring us dramatically closer to becoming carbon neutral. One thing I've learned through our renovations process is that there are so many helpful technologies and resources available right now to any new building in the district, no matter who owns it, so that it can be built to be highly efficient and to generate clean energy on site. In fact, Mr. Chairman and to Council Member Pinto, I would love to invite you personally to come and tour our building and see the renovations in progress right now at your convenience. As a faith organization, our witness is not just defined by what we say, but by what we do and what we choose to invest in. Renovating our building in a way that massively reduces our climate impact is vitally important to us at the Festival Center because our faith calls us to first and foremost do no harm. Refusing to acknowledge our responsibility to use all available technologies to reduce the harm done to our planet and to care for all of creation would in fact be a denial of our faith. In passing the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act, the council has already held private buildings to a high net zero standard. And so I call on the council to enact the same net zero standard for the government buildings in the Greener Government Buildings Act as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Chris Weiss, welcome.
Thank you. I love the Festival Center. My father worked on starting a church there many years ago.
Oh, great.
Weiss. I don't know, maybe you knew him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Where's my, oh, there I am. Okay. Good afternoon, Chairperson White, Councilperson Pinto, and other council members and staff. My name is Chris Weiss, and I'm the Executive Director of the DC Environmental Network. I want to acknowledge the leadership you, Chairperson White, and the Greener Government Buildings Amendment Act of 2022 co-introducers are demonstrating by moving this important bill. I am testifying today to strongly support the intent of the Greener Government Buildings Amendment Act of 2022 and to make recommendations and support the recommendations of my brothers and sisters in the district's climate crisis movement that will both help this bill avoid the perception of greenwashing and require the district's government buildings follow the same rules and regulations that we require of privately owned buildings. Understanding the committee is already creating a new draft, I would still like to put my concerns on the current language on record. The DC Environmental Network would like to note that at both this hearing today, would also like to note that at this hearing on Monday on 2 proposed solar bills, which we were very happy that Councilmember Pinto also participated in, how wonderful and beneficial it was and is to our city to have so many committed energy experts sharing their thoughts, including today, the lead author of the district's Clean Energy DC plan, Edward Yim, and Cliff Majersic, who has been engaged at every level as the city created benchmarking the sustainable energy utility and our nation's leading building energy performance standards. Along with the testimony of key climate leaders, Mark Rotifer, Patricia Briggs, Shimani Overby, Barbara Briggs, and others, I'm confident we are collectively sharing the best expertise we can. We hope it helps. The DC Environmental Network likes this bill's intentions, including requiring new or substantially renovated government buildings be net zero energy and not burn fossil fuels on site, and requiring the Department of General Services to provide important trainings on net zero energy construction and maintenance for DC government staff, small businesses based in DC, and other interested parties. The DC Environmental Network is concerned this bill as written would classify DC government buildings as net zero, even if the buildings are not highly energy efficient and do not generate renewable energy on site, allows DC government buildings not to follow the same clean energy DC building codes that privately owned buildings have to follow, inconsistent with intent by potentially allowing fossil fuel combustion in new government buildings, a weaker standard than required for private buildings, does not embrace the clean energy DC building code hierarchy, and leaves the door open for greenwashing or the perception of greenwashing by allowing DC government to procure renewable energy credits for offsite electricity that does not supply electricity to the building. I'm actually having a text conversation with a few people on whether I should call it greenwashing, so I may amend my testimony down the road. Every day, the news is showing how the climate crisis is impacting people's lives in a devastating manner. This committee, the council as a whole, and the executive have taken leadership and adopted nation-leading clean energy DC building codes and are moving towards enforcement of focused building energy performance standards, all that should apply to public and privately owned buildings alike. It makes no sense as national leaders of climate policy to ask private building owners to comply with these requirements while we are potentially creating loopholes for and allowing the perception of greenwashing by district government buildings. Environmental advocates have created a list of changes the DC Environmental Network would like to see made to the bill to move us towards fully supporting it. I have included them in my testimony. I'm not going to read them. My colleagues have done a great job doing that. Thank you so much. And I have to go in about 5 minutes. Thanks for holding this hearing.
Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. I know you gave us a heads up that you have a hard stop. Let me turn to our final panelist, Barbara Briggs. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you, Council Members White and Pinto. My name is Barbara Briggs, and I'm testifying today on behalf of Friends Meeting of Washington's Committee on Peace and Social Concerns. Our Quaker meeting is a member of the Washington Interfaith Network, advocating on matters of concern for DC's low-income communities. And we also partner with the Sierra Club and Interfaith Power and Light on climate issues. As Quakers, we are led to work for social and economic justice and to protect the rights of vulnerable communities and the ecosystems that support our lives. In the last couple of years, we've been focusing very heavily on the critical issue of speeding DC's transition from fossil fuels to clean, renewable energy sources. Of particular concern is the so-called natural gas methane used for heating and cooking in over half of DC's buildings, which is a powerful climate disrupting greenhouse gas when it leaks into the air. We are also learning more and more about the pollutants emitted when gas is burned, including nitrogen dioxide, which is a pulmonary irritant, which contributes to asthma and lung disease. Transition is not as easy as continuing with business as usual, and it costs more initially. But we all know that in order to prevent catastrophic climate disruption, we must stop burning fossil fuels. And taking the health and human costs resulting from exposure to fossil fuel emissions into account, the benefits will quickly outweigh the additional expenses related to transition to clean energy sources. So we want to thank Council Members White and the committee and colleagues for this initiative to make DC government buildings cleaner. It's critical that the district government take the lead in assuring that its own installations are built to net zero standards at every opportunity, starting with new construction and substantial renovation of our schools, libraries, and all government buildings. The Greener Government Buildings Act language calling for expanded training in net zero building construction and maintenance is also very important, as there's a great lack of such technical expertise at present. If DC government can break this ground, growing the pool of workers trained in construction and maintenance of its net zero buildings, it will be in a better position to help the private sector, houses of faith like ours, and homeowners do the same. Our own Quaker meeting experienced the difficulty of moving toward net zero in our own building construction several years ago. We made progress, but are still using some gas. Had stronger net zero technical guidance been available, we might have been able to go all the way. I think prior witnesses have voiced a serious concern that I share, that the bill as we understand it is presently written to allow for alternate net zero standard. We are in agreement, and it sounds like you are too, that it's important that all DC be working from one consistent net zero standard like the one recently passed in the Clean Energy DC Building Code Act. Our Quaker meeting and houses of faith across the district are increasingly concerned about the issue of climate change and about the health and well-being of DC residents and families related to fossil fuel emissions. Increasingly, we see no daylight between those two concerns. And provided that this bill is amended to include a single net zero standard, we will celebrate the passage of the Greener Government Buildings Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much to this panel. Patricia Briggs, to your challenge that you offered at the end of your testimony. Yes, I do commit to closing the loophole. I want to make sure we're clear on that. I also grew up at St. Augustine's Church, so I don't want you over there talking bad about me because I still know folks there. I really do appreciate this panel. Let me get some clarification. Bill Mefford, your organization, do you provide office space for nonprofits or housing?
Well, it's office space, but we say because affordable housing is such an important thing that oftentimes nonprofits have been left out of that conversation. So
I agree.
It is office space. No one lives at the festival center.
Okay, well that's an incredible need that you're filling there. So I'm excited to hear about it. But you also let me ask about with the work that you have been doing. In renovating your building, are there any carbon reducing, changes or modifications that you have wanted to make but you weren't able to because of either the building layout or because they are cost prohibitive?
There are. I could get you a fuller list. I'm sitting there racking my brain as soon as you mention that. Can I submit that through Sean later? Because I know
absolutely
we have had those conversations, and I just want to make sure that I'm specific and correct in what I tell you. So let me share those to you through Sean, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Do you have thought? One of the other aspects of the bill is that it provides periodic trainings on construction maintenance and operations. And these trainings include not just government workers, but private sector nonprofits as well, to really help them understand construction options and trends, how to maintain this, because it sort of, purchasing and installing green technology is one thing, but folks have to know how to maintain it. Do you have thoughts on how important or not important that aspect would be?
I think, well, right now we're in the midst of the renovations. So I can only guess that it's going to be vitally important. But we're already starting to work with, we're working through USource Services.
Okay.
That's who is our contractor. So we're already starting to put in place some organizations and groups that we're going to be working with. We're trying to figure out who those are going to be to maintain, especially the solar panels. I know Columbia Solar is going to be the organization that works there. But yes, we are going to be kind of figuring out what those are going to be, but that's going to be vital to maintaining a low carbon output.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I don't have any other questions for this panel because I think we're on agreement with the major concern that everybody had, and we've already started working through that, and we'll continue to do so before we pass it out of the committee. And I think that everyone will be very happy with the final language. We're essentially doing exactly what you're asking. So I do want to thank you all for taking the time, for your focus and attention on what is really an important issue that we have to take up and take seriously. Not just for ourselves, but for future generations. And I'm excited to see how many young people are focused on climate change. So I think we've got some very strong leaders coming up in the rear who are going to take the work that we're doing to the next level. So thank you all for your participation in this hearing and the ongoing work that you're doing. We will now move to our government witness. And so I want to welcome Associate Director for Sustainability and Energy Management, Matt Flocka, and Deputy Director for Capital Construction, Tiffany Moore. Welcome to both of you. As you know, it is the practice of this committee to swear in our government witnesses. So I'd ask that you both raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to provide to the Committee on Government Operations and Facilities is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you so much. You can begin your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairman White, Councilmember Pinto, and staff of the Committee on Government Operations and Facilities. I am Matt Flocka, Associate Director of the Sustainability and Energy Division for the Department of General Services, and I thank you for the opportunity to present testimony today regarding Bill 240785, the Greener Government Buildings Amendment Act of 2022. This legislation would require all major, new, or substantially improved government buildings to comply with net zero energy design principles, as well as codify the agency's Sustainability and Energy Division. Additionally, the legislation would require DGS to train facility staff, certified business enterprises, and other interested parties in relevant energy efficiency technologies, give net zero building priority consideration for the district's leasing needs, and report every 2 years on CBE and resident employee participation in net zero energy and energy retrofitting projects. DGS is committed to helping the district's energy conservation and emission reduction goals and supports the intent of the legislation to reduce building energy consumption. The agency has been a leader on net zero design, and we have already delivered John Lewis Elementary School and Banneker High School as net zero ready. In addition, the agency has plans to deliver 3 new net zero ready buildings over the next several years: Bard High School, Raymond Elementary, and Stead Park Rec. While DGS has shown commitment to net zero design, and we continue our momentum, it is important to recognize that the reality of some buildings are not candidates for net zero design. As drafted in the long title of the bill, the intent is to require new or substantially improved buildings to adhere to net zero energy standards. This language, however, does not take into account the limitations that exist in law, building code, and technology that makes net zero impossible in some cases. The agency recommends that these limitations be clarified in the legislation and that the legislation include a clear definition of net zero design standards. For buildings that are incapable of meeting net zero design standards, DGS remains committed to employing as many energy-saving designs as possible. To better explain these limitations around net zero design, I'd like to share some examples. One is Adams Education Campus, which has a modernization scheduled in the CIP capital improvement plan to deliver in 2025. The school is not a candidate to be net zero energy ready for a few reasons. The first of which is the preservation of its historic structure and facade constraints. The school has been deemed historic based on the age of the building, and therefore we must follow specific design guidelines. Adams Education Campus has sloped roofs, and the Historic Preservation Office and the Commission of Fine Arts will not allow solar panels on historic structures in this case, especially where visible sloped roofs can occur. There are also limitations on making the interior space more efficient, since the Historic Preservation Society typically looks at maintaining existing corridors and stairwell locations, even if they do not allow for optimal efficiency in terms of energy use per square foot. The second limitation is the physical site. The existing site of the campus poses some severe constraints, including the very small number of necessary changes that have to happen or could happen within the space to facilitate a geothermal well system. Because the existing building is historic, the structure must remain in place, and there are no opportunities to maximize the limited site. Another example of a site that is not conducive to building net zero facilities are properties that fall within the flood zone. This is the case for both Thomas Elementary School and Drew Elementary School. Construction on a flood zone for any of the assets in our portfolio causes many challenges, but the biggest impact related to building a net zero facility is that geothermal wells are not allowed to be installed in a flood zone area. And geothermal wells are one of the best ways to lower the energy use per square foot of a building. Additionally, as we plan ahead and make decisions on new and existing structures, we must also balance costs and the environmental factors of new construction. Estimated costs and construction times will increase, and embodied carbons that come from fabricating materials like concrete, steel, and windows also need to be accounted for. Although it is not feasible to comply with net zero energy design principles on all projects, we still place a high value on energy efficiency and include language in all requests for proposals for design build contracts that specifies projects shall be designed in such a way to incorporate certifications and globally recognized standards for efficient, cost-effective, and environmentally friendly practices. Such practices include LEED Gold certification, pursuing WELL Gold, requiring our roof projects to be solar ready when possible, and requiring construction to comply with energy use intensity of 20 or less to meet energy consumption goals of the project. DGS recommends that the committee consider a change to the legislative language that takes the limitations of design factors into account so that the agency can still deliver energy efficient buildings when net zero design is not possible. We are happy to partner with the committee on crafting language that will make the bill more feasible to implement. In addition to discussing the importance of constructing buildings in an environmentally responsible way, we also want to highlight the impact of building occupant behavior on net zero goals. Our capital construction division works very hard to ensure that effective and efficient planning and project management of all our construction project happens, but it is a reality that occupant behavior affects the energy performance of a building once it is delivered. Client agencies that occupy buildings will need to be committed to the goal and adhere to the net zero operating requirements for our joint energy consumption needs to be met. Occupants will also need to commit to such practices as unplugging microwaves and mini fridges when not in use, and not changing preset temperature points to release more heating or cooling, as this causes a spike in energy consumption when it happens. In the absence of these kind of adjustments, the buildings would use a lot more energy than anticipated and make it very difficult to reach our goals. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this measure, and we stand ready to work with the council to address any needed changes. And I'm happy with my colleague Tiffany Moore to stay and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. And first, Mr. Floka, let me apologize for mispronouncing your last name earlier. Welcome to you both. And I appreciate your testimony. So the mayor signed a building code bill this summer that will require NZE compliance beginning 5 years from now, including for substantially improved public buildings. You obviously just suggested that some existing buildings can never be upgraded to net zero standards. So how does DGS intend to comply with the existing law to clean energy DC building code changes?
Well, I can say that our energy management plan does take a look at a lot of the net zero energy ready candidates. So if you look at our plan and see it, some of the well, the whole portfolio is evaluated, and we also look at some of the solar capacity per site. And this is kind of a roadmap to tell us which sites are good candidates for our net zero buildings and which sites are potentially not good candidates for net zero buildings. So that gives us the whole portfolio view of you know, how we could achieve net zero across DGS, which is also tied back to the Clean Energy DC legislation and the Omnibus Act. So I think the energy management plan gives us a good framework and you know, a good decision tree on deciding when and how we should pursue net zero.
So I don't think that the bill that was just signed into law a few months ago creates any carve outs. I understand you to be saying that DGS doesn't think that some of our existing buildings will be able to reach net zero compliance. So we're going to have a conflict between our law and what DGS believes it can perform.
I think there could be a you know, a discrepancy. What I do think we have to look at though is the DGS, you know, DC government portfolio as a whole. You know, in the public testimony there was a lot of conversation about kind of greenwashing, and I think one of the best ways that DGS can achieve some of these net zero goals is to look at its whole portfolio and the whole potential to generate solar across the portfolio, combined with a lot of these new major construction projects. And you know, when we have a site that's really able to generate a lot of solar and has the physical site to install the geothermal wells like we would like to, and also you know, a budget to do all of those things, that can help offset the energy use for sites that are not good candidates for net zero. So I think there is a formula here and a plan that we have to create. I don't think it's infeasible to meet some of these requirements, but it is something that we actually have to plan out, if that makes sense.
All right. On the budget piece, I'll come to that later. If this bill doesn't pass, when do you expect DGS would start building all of its new buildings to NZE standards?
Well, it's something that it's a conversation that we have with every design team, and we do you know, we do approach all of our major modernizations with this conversation in mind. All of our, like I mentioned, all of our RFPs for these design build projects do have an energy use intensity goal, which is really the EUI of a building is the kind of the threshold, if you will, to seeing whether or not you can generate as much power as you need on site. So while we're not saying every single building right now has the has it written in that you're going to try to achieve net zero, we do have a lot of energy use and energy efficiency requirements in our RFPs that help, I think, very exhaustively move the needle on energy efficiency. So, I mean, EUI is really very important, and understanding that going into the project is really important to how a building is designed and constructed. Almost more so, I'd say, than saying it needs to be net zero, because you're gonna establish your EUI goals at the beginning of the project, even if net zero is not is not possible.
But how would it not be possible for new construction?
I think we'll just go back to Adams, for example.
Well, I'm talking new construction here, not modern. Yeah,
a brand new building.
Yes.
Well, if there are no historic limitations, new construction is definitely the easiest way to achieve it. And maybe Tiffany, if you want to chime in on that, I think it'd be helpful.
I would say, I mean, in general, we're already moving towards that direction. Just as a whole, the agency thinks that improving our design and our processes to make sure that we're, not negatively impacting the environment as much as possible is already something that, we think is important, and we don't necessarily need to be forced to do it, because we already think it's a good idea. We don't have to be convinced. And that's how we're already approaching things, just as Matt Focus said. It's already in the RFPs. That's how our new designs for major construction is. We're already in process. We're not, thinking about it, researching it. We're already doing it. We've already developed, delivered two. We're in the process of delivering, more brand new facilities with that will be net zero ready. So we're already started the process, basically.
So I know that obviously DGS has been doing that and has delivered Banneker and
West.
Thank you. Yes, at net zero. We have not, over the past 3-4 years, been able to get a commitment. This is prior to the DC Buildings Code Act, a commitment from DGS that all new construction would be net zero. I think originally there was some concern about possible cost implications. The delivery of Banneker and West, I think, showed that didn't bear out, that the construction costs were relatively equivalent to what they would have done, is my recollection from the agency's testimony, but still, again, had not over the past several years been able to get a commitment that all new construction would be net zero and comply with the net zero energy standard. So are you saying, Ms. Moore, that all new construction at this point is complying with this standard?
I mean, I'd like to. It's hard to take a one size fits all with as much work that we are responsible for. So, I would definitely say that the agency has been hesitant to just step out there with all that we know that it takes to meet such a goal, to make that blanket statement, and even in the reference that you made to Banneker and West, I think it deserves a little bit of clarification. We were able to do those schools and include the net zero scope within the budget that we had. However, there is always a cost associated with making a building new or refurbishing an existing building net zero. I mean, it is incorrect to assume that you can build a non-net zero building for the same, with the same features or the same accommodations that you can for, a net zero building. There's costs associated. So we just always have to manage those costs based on the budgets that we have and the requirements of what our client agencies are asking us to provide with them. Managing, programmatic space, managing exterior space. Those type of things come into play. And of course, we don't have an unlimited budget. So oftentimes there's a discussion, can we afford to do this? Can we afford to do solar? Even if we can physically put it in there, do we have the additional, $1.5 to $2 million to do it? There's associated costs with the geothermal wells as well. Those things cost significant. Those are increased capital investments. Now, do we agree that they're good investments to make? We do. However, it's still very difficult to say that we can always do it from here on out. Again, not knowing what our future budget constraints are going to be. That's not something that DGS has control of.
Those are fair points, but I do want to sort of remind us that the law at this point says that all new construction will be NZE compliant by 2027. So the question here is, can we accelerate it? We shouldn't be having a discussion about whether or not we can do this. This discussion is about really whether or not we can accelerate, because the mayor already signed this into law. So this is the direction that DGS must be moving to be in compliance with the law. We've talked a bit about this, but not directly. What are the biggest common obstacles to net zero readiness when you build new buildings, other than cost?
One would be building on a floodplain, and the size of the site as well. Would you agree, Matt?
Yeah, the size of the site, the orientation of the site. I think one of the things that we're talking about here is it a renovation or is it new construction? It's very, if you think about some of the smaller client agency buildings that we have, like a fire station, building a new fire station is very different than building a new school, and where is that in the city? So the site limitations are definitely a huge factor, because it makes an impact on the systems that we put into the building, but also on how much energy we can generate physically within the constraints of the site with solar panels, because that's obviously key to the factor, the foundation of net zero. So site, the systems that we put into the building, and then really the budget. But I don't keep going back to that.
Do you have an idea of, I'm more familiar with floodplains on federal land than I am with district-owned land. Do you have a sense of how much district-owned land is within a floodplain?
We do, and we work with DOEE to really take a hard look at those floodplain maps, and look at when capital projects are coming up. But we do, with our work with DOEE, definitely have an understanding of the flood maps here in the district, and how many of our sites are fall within those constraints. Definitely.
Another constraint I've thought of regarding new construction, buildings like Banneker and West are really exceptions. Oftentimes, even our new construction is either adding on to an existing structure, or so that still factors in that existing structure that we're attaching the new structure to still comes into play and has to be taken under consideration, especially if it's historic.
For still made it? No. I take your point there. For ground up construction, if we think about something like Banneker, how does, say before these requirements in existing law in 2027 kick in, how does DGS currently decide project by project whether it will pursue net zero energy?
We would take into consideration what the goals that we were trying to achieve with the new building, and if the parameters allowed for it to, for the design to be net zero, and of course the budget.
I think I'll also just mention there is, I won't go back to again, but in our energy management plan, if you look at page, I think it's 29 or 30 of the plan, there is like a decision tree that helps point us in the right direction for whether or not a site or a facility is a good candidate for net zero. So that is a factor that helps us.
Okay. And who are you, Mr. Flocka, the primary sort of, advocacy voice or voice focused, on the environmental energy efficient side of this? Is that the role you play in these discussions, or does the agency bring in other people or organizations to help make that evaluation?
No, I mean, while the sustainability and energy division is a big voice for energy conservation and efficiency on all of our efforts across DGS, I think we definitely rely on the architects and engineers that capital construction hires to really dig down into the exact feasibility of whether or not a site is able to achieve net zero. So while I think collectively S&E and capital construction try to push DGS in the right way, I mean, we rely on our AE teams. I don't know, Tiffany, if you agree with that.
Yes.
You rely on your what? I'm sorry.
Architect and engineering teams, the AE, which
Okay.
design.
Why do they care? Why is that? Yeah. Why do they care whether it's net zero?
Well, we do put hard requirements into the RFPs, but a lot of these firms care about the environment too, and care about making the right decisions. And we push them in the right direction, I'd say. I mean, we care for the efficiency means, the climate means. Those are the reasons why we care, and we impress those priorities onto our design teams. So they care from a contractual requirement, but I will say a lot of the architects and engineers that we work with are like-minded and also care about the environment, definitely.
All right. That leaves me pretty concerned, because all these folks have many other priorities that aren't necessarily the environment. And if DGS is our construction lead, and we as a city prioritize green building, then I would think that there'd be somebody at the table who is prioritizing this particular issue. There are so many aspects that go into construction. It just seems like we have a recipe for focusing. We have a recipe for this issue falling through the cracks.
Well,
I think you may. I think maybe just to clarify Matt's point, we look to the AE firms to identify our options, bring us the new technology that's in the market that can solve for the problems that we're trying to address. Not that they are leading the actual decisions. They're doing it because we're telling them to. but they are the experts in the industry. And so we look to them for these design solutions. So I wouldn't say that we're just kind of riding along with the AE firms that maybe don't have this as their number one priority. I mean, we're their client. So their priority is to provide us what we ask them for within the constraints that we provide.
And so what do you ask them for? What specific to NZE compliance or net zero construction?
The basic question is, how do we make this building net zero? What options do we need to include? What systems should we include? What new technologies are there that we can try that maybe we haven't tried before? Those are the questions that we sit and have with our design teams as these projects are being planned.
Okay, and those questions are being asked consistently?
Yes.
What is the cost difference looking at Banneker and John Lewis, the two net zero buildings that DGS has done a tremendous job bringing online? What have we learned in terms of increased construction costs by looking at those projects?
I mean, if we're going to add, say, for example, two of the three main components being solar or geothermal systems, we're looking, we're looking about adding an additional $3 to $4 million in capital costs, and that's just solar and geothermal. That's still not other things, but those are two of the big ticket items.
What have we done an analysis of the additional cost to net zero construction, a specific analysis so that we understand if we what the true cost to the district is? We budget in 4-year terms, but the payoff for a lot of green construction will take longer than 4 years to sort of be realized. And I think it would be helpful for us to know whether in 10 years, 20 years, we are paying less in the long term by doing net zero or more in the long term. Have we done that type of financial analysis?
We could definitely get back to you with a more thorough answer, but in short, we have Banneker and West are still in their, I would say, infant stages of operation, and the biggest component to measuring the effectiveness of your net zero design is how does the building actually operate? We would still need data on the energy usage of the actual buildings to then look back and do an analysis. So that's the thing. You can't measure the effectiveness of your net zero design on day one. That's not how it works. That's more so a consideration of something like LEED, where you put this in the building, you get the credits, the building is LEED certified. Net zero is focused on operations.
But there is a construction cost component. So even if we are looking at operations over 5 years, the only way we can't do a calculation of the cost without including construction costs. Construction is finished on both these buildings. So what I'm asking is, do we have a breakdown of what construction costs on those buildings compared to what it would have cost if it was not net zero?
We could get back to you and try to look at some of our previous projects, or just possibly take those components out and say, we would have saved X amount of dollars. But I'm not sure if that independent of comparing it to the energy savings would actually be a relevant analysis. It'd just be a cost differential, but we don't know if the differential would have been worth, the potential gain down the road.
I mean, obviously, there's plenty we don't know at this point, but I just don't see how we do a cost analysis without including the construction costs, and construction has
You would
finished.
definitely include
But
it.
in terms of um, cost savings we would expect, these aren't the first net zero buildings in the world. So my hope is that we have been looking at net zero construction in other parts of the country or other parts of the world and have some type of estimate as to what we expect. Have we done that? Are we looking at net zero construction in other places?
Yes.
Okay. And is there anything we can glean from that construction in terms of what we should expect with respect to cost savings and energy efficiencies?
I think what we can do is look at, so definitely, yeah, when we were in creating the energy management plan, net zero is definitely a factor of the Omnibus Act. So we can look at some of the data we collected during creating that plan, look at some of the forecasted savings of a net zero building versus what we're actually seeing at these two sites, and get back to you with some hard data and a forecast, if you will.
I appreciate that. About how long do you think that would take to send to the committee?
Well, I think a piece of it is looking at how much utility data we actually have on each one of the buildings to see if it's a good sample of all seasons, see how much we've actually used. And I'm not sure exactly how long, what span we have that utility data for these two sites, but we can get back to you within 2 weeks and let you know a little more hard numbers on how Banneker and West are doing and what some of the industry standards are for net zero.
I appreciate it. Information on the construction costs, the operating costs so far, to the extent you have that, and expected operations costs or savings based on your analysis of other net zero construction in other places. That data would be particularly helpful to us. So within the next 2 weeks, we will get that from you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. The bill would also require DGS to stop installing any new fossil fuel systems as soon as this bill becomes law. The council recently passed the Climate Commitment Act of 2022, which bans government installation of fossil fuel systems after 2024, except where, quote, technically infeasible. What's the anticipated useful life of a typical new fossil fuel heating system?
Well, it depends. I think it depends on the system. You could be talking anything from a gas stove to a gas generator to a rooftop unit that's served by natural gas. So I think those things have very different useful lives. If that's what you're asking.
Yeah. So I mean, let's use those 3 examples.
So those
well, we don't need a stove. We can take the stove out.
Well, those 3 came to mind because they just were very relevant in our conversations with net zero at Banneker and Lewis, because DCPS at these large feeding sites, right? They need a kitchen that can serve the amount of students in the area or at the school that they need to feed. And the decision was, well, the question I guess at the time was, can you do that with an all electric kitchen? And we just weren't sure. The other question about an emergency generator, if the emergency generator is not natural gas, you don't have a natural gas emergency generator or service for that emergency generator, then what's that generator going to run off of? Diesel. So there are carve outs like a generator or a kitchen, which are kind of caveats, but those have very different life cycles or lifespans than a rooftop unit, which is served by natural gas for heating. And the technology, you can get a rooftop unit nowadays with heat pump technology that does not have a natural gas connection, or has natural gas only for a second stage of heating when the temperatures get really cold. But those are a rooftop unit is has a life expectancy of 20 years. So when you put that unit in place, you're committing, if it is served by natural gas, to burning fossil fuels for that life expectancy of the piece of equipment.
If this bill doesn't pass, what's DGS's current plan for deciding whether alternatives are feasible or not starting in 2024? So again, this bill would require DGS to stop installing any new fossil fuel systems as soon as this bill becomes law. But the council recently passed the Climate Commitment Act of 2022, which bans government installation of fossil fuel systems after 2024. So what I'm asking here is, if we don't pass this bill and this 2024 ban on installing fossil fuel systems goes into effect, what's the current plan for deciding alternatives, where alternatives are feasible, or what alternatives are feasible, I should say?
So I may be missing the intent of the question. I guess you're asking for what else are we doing, maybe, or what?
Okay, let me start here. This will probably be more clear. Do you see an issue with DGS being in compliance with the Climate Commitment Act of 2024, which bans government installation of fossil fuel systems after 2024?
It still has, like you said, it does have the caveat, I guess, where technologically not possible.
Yes, and so so there's a caveat for where it is technologically infeasible. My next question is what might make a non-fossil fuel system infeasible?
I mean, I think an emergency generator is one of the best examples, right? You have to generate the power for an emergency generator, and that's done with diesel or natural gas. So maybe there are new technologies that help us move the needle on that. Kitchen burning natural gas burning equipment in kitchens is definitely another example. Can you, with an all-electric kitchen, can you actually prepare the amount of food that DCPS might need to? So I think with HVAC, it's a little less of an issue, because the technology is definitely getting there, but that technology does have a cost, and I think there are things that we need to look at. I have a couple of specific examples I'd be happy to kind of go into when we're talking about HVAC equipment that does not burn fossil fuels, but you don't want to take the risk of replacing a $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 piece of equipment with the technology that is not necessarily proven just yet. So
okay, go ahead.
So I think the example of a generator and then even back to some of our fire stations, a lot of those fire stations have big apparatus bays, and you have to look at the cost of heating those apparatus bays to keep the equipment warm in the winter. And what's the difference between doing that with natural gas, doing that with radiant heat from the slab? There are definitely some systems out there that make it pretty infeasible to do that.
So I understand your point about making sure the technology we want to rely on is proven technology. And I think HVAC is an example of that. We moved some years ago to what seemed like a better technology on HVAC systems, and those systems have not worked well for us. And I think that we are looking back at sort of the older HVAC systems. So I get that point. What I would ask here is, what are we doing at Banneker and John Lewis Elementary with respect to emergency generators in their kitchens?
I believe both have they are both natural gas. They both are provided with natural gas. Those are the only two systems though at each one of those sites that have a natural gas connection.
Okay.
But you can still I forget the name, Tiffany. Maybe you can remind me, the IFLI certification, the Institute for so there's an institute that helps with certifying a building as net zero, and those are some of the exceptions that they do understand and they do grant, because the cost of natural gas in a generator that's only used a couple hours a month is very, very different than the cost of natural gas in a rooftop unit that runs constantly. So there's different levels to each one of the consumptions there, but they are supplied by natural gas.
Mr. Floka, I understand you have a hard stop in just a few minutes. I know DCPS is closed today. That affects my my day as well. Ms. Moore, are you able to stay with us and answer a question? There are some questions I had that I think you'd be able to answer.
Yes. How much longer do you think?
Depends on the length of the answers. I mean, I would say an hour at the most. If
Yes, if we could just take a brief recess for me to return a call from my son's school, that would be helpful. But
okay,
otherwise, yes.
What is okay? I don't want to put you in a bad spot as a parent. I don't want your son upset with me. What time would you need to take a recess?
If we could take a recess right now for about 10 minutes, and then we could resume if you'd like.
Okay. Will that work for you? Or I think the alternative is I can get through the rest of my questions in 20 minutes. Would you
Oh,
prefer
that's
to?
fine.
Okay, let's do that. Mr. Floka, when you need to drop out, go ahead and do so. And let me just say thank you now for being with us, and we will continue to work with you.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, these are difficult times, and schools close when they close. So I want to make sure I'm asking the most important questions. So under the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act of 2018, DGS was required to make a plan for building energy retrofitting. That plan took over 3 years to prepare, was delivered late. Some aspects of the plan are very good. Some places I think still lack detail, like location-specific cost estimates. Where in the emergency management plan should we be looking to see which upcoming projects are not slated for NZE compliance?
So the plan does not have specific sites called out in it. That is an effort that is kind of still ongoing, but it does look at the whole portfolio and give some pretty hard figures over I think it's close to 26 million square feet that are required to be compliant with BEPS, and looks at which sites are good candidates for net zero, which sites have the solar capacity on a percentage basis, which sites have the sufficient roof size to generate the amount of solar on site that you would need to be considered a good net zero candidate. So, I think it's pages like 27, 28, 29, 30, which really get into some of the net zero or talks about the net zero work that we put into the plan.
Okay. Does DGS intend to start indicating at any point which upcoming projects specifically will not be NZE compliant?
I think that's something we can definitely discuss and talk about how you may want to see that commitment. But I again, I think going back to what Tiffany was saying, it is something that a process we go through with each one of the major projects, and how do we maybe firm that up in a report? We can definitely discuss what that looks like. I'd be happy to do that.
Okay. You mentioned in your testimony that construction practices are only part of the issue here when we're talking about energy efficiency, and that building occupant behavior is another key determinant of actual energy usage or savings. What is DGS doing to help sort of get the message out or influence or impact building occupant behavior?
I can give two good examples. One that DGS is kind of leading with DCPS right now, and another that kind of the other way around. So first, we're trying to we have a draft of this set point policy, if you will, right? Here's the high and low based on the season that HVAC system should operate within. And we're working with DCPS to pilot that in a few locations. Because if you create those constraints across all of DCPS to what occupancy temperatures are acceptable at any given time, then that is definitely, you're putting your hands around that energy hog, your HVAC systems, and you don't have occupants cooling the space to 60 degrees in the summertime, or heating it to 78 in the winter. So that's an effort in constraining or officializing our set points across the board. So that's a big occupant training effort that we're undergoing with DCPS. And then DCPS has a great pilot of a system over at Jackson Reed, which is really, I kind of sum it up to chasing really like what are called vampire loads, and making sure like lights go off when they're supposed to go off, or computers are turned off when they're supposed to turn off, and getting occupants in the school to really understand what waste is and how impactful that can be. And DCPS has done a great job with this kind of pilot over at Jackson Reed, and it's probably something you'd be interested in looking at.
Yeah.
So those are two good occupancy training efforts, if you will, that come to mind.
I appreciate that. Change of behavior can take a long time. And so we counterbalance that with technology like lights that go off when someone isn't in a room. But we do have to work to change behaviors if we're going to see the true savings and energy efficiency that we want to. One of the other aspects of the bill is that it contemplates training every 2 years for government personnel and also for private parties such as CVEs regarding green construction and maintenance. Do you have any legislative recommendations for the committee on how to refine this aspect of the bill, or what technical support you're currently providing to businesses in this area?
So I will say that training is, especially on any efficient new system, is very important, and training the CVEs that we engage and the FTEs that we have hired on these new systems is extremely important. I think that the DGS mission is not too focused on training the public, if you will, but we're definitely committed to discussing what training our contractors and our FTEs looks like. And I think that is a conversation we need to have soon in reference to this bill. I know that I think it'd be really helpful to define the expectations of what the committee might want to see on those trainings up front, so we can help meet them and figure out what that cost is going to be. And then we definitely would have to partner with our client agencies, DOES, some of the other DSLBD, some of the other entities in DC government that may have some more of those outward focused trainings or abilities to train the public or other contractors that we might not directly engage in.
Okay. One of the hardest things about these NZE efforts is going to be the budgeting. This has come up a couple times. The way we do financial planning in the city, it only goes out 4 years. So all extra building costs are staring us in the face, and savings, are difficult to calculate the way we budget in government, is especially in the district government. But we don't tend to capture the long-term cost savings from energy reductions and energy efficiencies, not to mention other social benefits. I think one of the witnesses put something similar to this in the chat. So how do you, in doing an analysis as to whether or not you're going to meet NZE standards or other energy efficient standards, how do you account for the long-term savings? Yeah, let me stop there. How do you measure the long-term savings, or do you look at that beyond 4 years?
Well, I think the long-term savings are energy costs, right? That's your long-term saving, or the biggest long-term saving. I think the other savings to look at is the life cycle of your equipment, if it's well maintained, and not having to replace equipment before a rooftop unit before that 20-year mark. So once you design a building and you look at the energy use that can be expected, you measure that against the actual use that you're seeing, and then you can use that actual use. And are you running your building, your equipment according to a schedule? And once you answer all of those questions, then you can start to say, this is my actual consumption of the building, and forecast that out. And that is something that we're actively doing and starting to stand up on the energy side and the energy expense side.
And in the same vein, how do you account for the risk that you'll install dirty machines in the short term at full cost, and then either we have to deal with the environmental impacts of that, or we'll have to pay to rip out machines that still have plenty of life left in them?
I don't think we have that is a big risk, right? If truly electrifying a building that was just installed with fossil fuel burning systems is a big cost and a risk, and not something that we don't want to do that. But I don't think we have a way to quantify that, or we're not looking at quantifying that right now.
Okay. I'm going to wrap up here, but let me say this as we do. I genuinely appreciate the work that DGS has done over the past several years, particularly with the very impressive net zero construction projects that you all have brought online. Your work in the energy plan and many other things that you have done. I am concerned that making sure that we are reducing our carbon footprint, that we're focused on NZE compliance, or as close to that as we can be, is something that is important to the agency, but not a priority for the agency. And I recognize you all may disagree. So this is something that I think we're going to have a conversation about, just to get on the same page and to understand if we are, pushing as hard as we can in this direction. I think that nationally people are really understanding the effects of climate change. I think this is something particularly important to younger people, to generations that are just starting to mature. And I'm very happy about it. I want to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to ensure the health, life, and safety of future generations, not just when it's convenient, but really pushing ourselves to do it at every possible turn. I recognize it's difficult. I also recognize that there may be times where it is not possible. I don't know yet within our current buildings, but I do want to make sure this is something that DGS is prioritizing. So we will have some future conversations on this, so I can better understand the work that you all are doing, how you see yourselves prioritizing it, and I will probably push you a bit on some of those points. So let me ask, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you want to, either if you want to put on the record?
Not from me, Tiffany.
I mean, I do want to highlight that even in instances where we're not net zero, we're still making strides and making our buildings more energy efficient overall. Maybe they just don't have, the new tag of being net zero, but each time we touch a building, we are improving the way that it operates, the way that it serves our client agencies and the public. And those things are just standard course of business. We might not put a big sign on it and say, give us a pat on the back, but that is the normal course of action for us. And that is indeed a priority.
I agree with that statement. So thank you for adding that. Let me thank all of our public witnesses and those who have tuned in. I want to mention that anyone who was not able to testify, written testimony is encouraged and will be made part of the official record. For anyone who is interested, you can submit a written testimony by email to facilities@dccouncil.gov, facilities@dccouncil.gov. The record for this hearing will close in 1 week at the close of business on Thursday, October 13th. With that, the business before the committee is concluded. The time is now 2:03 p.m. and this hearing is adjourned. Thank you both.